Tene ta kasing control kasing capsula jardo Bardo la number ye benani nipa check Bardo de check Bardo de la ta chitang che capsu tene ta de temrem tinzo kande jini yungi ye ba cheita tene de jesu tene ta ti temrem tinzo xiawe capsu nga rancho ge nyamling kande nangugi ye ba ta ti korte hibare la ta terenge capsu la xiarlam po ge damba ye ba ta ti xior la ta nyamling tupa je chona ti xior la ta po de gomna pe pento chempo yungi ye ba che re tene po te yang po la tene ta tanda jitang po tu dang tene po dang ba dang tene po le la jarwa te ta rimba yendo song yo re la tene te yang jitang po te ta jitang on tu se na tene namjor pa pe cheparji nyamtu cheparji tenzo la tampoa gugyo mare ranghingi tene tabi hinkang pepa yinayo rong ranghingi tene ngambar zupar sang jepa yinayo rong tene ta te tabi ge chepartan papa yungyo re la tene yinaya ta te tabi ge kashi gen puwa jape ge chol nze yo re song tanda te ge nang to song na tene jagarni loben luduk puwa nang ge chol tang tene je marba pendi ina je marba loza tene tangpo domi mate tene tanda marba loza latem marba loza tene kuluya sangni tene tang ngaranso poa jamnan dende ji jagure sangni tene uti te ya yal poani tene te no ne we kado ngadong temba chun je tenga namkala yang pot ni namkala ro chul temba
Tupa ngusa pot noi.
Tupa di yang pot song tu usi di salba yal wi kyol tu no tende gel ta lo ju ti song re la tene te yendo ta tanda chuchi mangbo ge ta tende jine we ge namban ro ta tene hyalchem ge ngor song di yo la jo ni tene we karbo je chang tene karbote namkhala ya jeje rini tene njada weda tele ge nambe namkha chap go pata tende tutop ndabo ta tende namba mambo nang yo lo ju ndabo tende nang yo are la ta hinna ya ta tenzo tene ta tani tene poa ngni go ge yo mare ta ngre zuntul ge namba temba re la tene ta tanda ngaranso poa gupate kandiresena chitanke mekyuma nanjurba nyamdo junzi yepa tharmasen pa ta tenzuge poa jagu yore so
Continuing from where we left off yesterday afternoon, from among the four bardos or intervals, we're still concerned with the second of these, which is the interval of the time of death. And so far, we've gone through two things about it. The first was the actual stages of dissolution, which make up the experience of death. And the second of which was what practices are needed in preparation for this and to be performed during these stages as well. At this point in our text, we're given instruction on one particular practice in the manner of something of a digression from the principal topic. And this particular practice is the ejection of consciousness. It is presented or focused on at this point in the practice because it is of such great benefit. There are several things that need to be understood about the ejection of consciousness. First is the time at which it is appropriate for it to be performed. Second is how you train yourself in the ability to do it. And the third is how you actually apply that ability or skill at the time of death. With regard to the ejection of consciousness, one should understand that in general, great yogins, those who have achieved consummate realization, do not actually need it, because through their realization, they will naturally or automatically take rebirth in a pure realm, or possibly even attain Buddhahood. So they do not depend upon the ejection of consciousness for the achievement of liberation. In spite of this fact, however, several Mahasiddhas have actually performed some form of the ejection of consciousness at the conclusion of their lives. Although they did not need to do so for their own benefit, it's assumed that they did so as to serve as an example for others. Renowned among these are from India, the great Pandit Nagarjuna, and from Tibet, Lord Marpa the translator, who at the end of his life caused his consort Dagmema to melt into light and dissolve into him. He then sat up straight, said to his attendants, "If you perform the ejection of consciousness, do it like this." He then blew the top of his skull off and caused a sphere of 5-colored light to shoot up into the sky. Many other siddhas have performed similar displays at the time of their deaths, such as shooting white light adorned with larger and smaller spheres of multicolored light out of their heads, and so on. But in all of these cases, while these individuals are exhibiting something that is similar to the transference of consciousness, it is not that they really depended upon it for the achievement of liberation. When we study and practice the ejection of consciousness, we are concerned with how it is practiced by a practitioner who does not have that degree of realization, and therefore requires a particular method to ensure their liberation.
Tene ta tanda chitang po japik tu rangin po japik tu ta yang yin po japik tu ta tende la yin po jap na yo tu la pap na po gu yo po ta jap gu yo re so re la tene te po japik tu te kandu re se na nyong rakpa thamba yin chi sur su spa tene ta sa chola thamba kap ta Chomela Timbekapta, Melona Timbekapta, Lonam Kala Timbekap La Sopa, Kap La Sopa La, Jaisena, Tenete Yar Suya Yorela, Iti Imbicherna, Tene Tanda Pojabing Mare, Swane, Tene Jignani and Sona, Tu la Papnam Po Shati, Tu mean Lana Separajorsi. Tene tu la pap nang tanguni chiwege tu tanala po jap na yapore mato tu main palam po jap na tene ngarang la jap ten tong tong ro se pege la ye pa tenzo ya nyom to se ro yo la tene teacher na ta tim po jap ga na ngarang hiwa to nyom to tenzo se pa na kin ro yo la teacher na po jap ning mare so la ati tene po jap mini pe jun sin che yang konza yin la la po andap nge na ta me yin to gin po jap kap la po tap nge so na tene ya ta nga tanda hig mare te yin na ya hiwege jun ra bo ji se son samne tene ke control sa wan ra bo tende yung segre control sawan rabo tenden samjurung yamba sauna desi negi yorela teni junsin teacher na chitang rangim phwa jabna ya teni ko tusi titaindo phwa jab go bache ta yen jim phwa jabna ya tusi titaindo phwa jab go bache re so ate ta tusi kadun pho go gre sauna ta tela teni ta tandang khasing huma hebege njua tenzo chasa tamchar chi of the chi tene nang noa ta nang namto tembe kap la rangin ji ju to pang kap la tene karlam charwata tene malam charwata tene nalam charwata tenzu kap sula pogo yo la ta zo rangin ni ki po su tab na ya ti kap sam po te kal che yo la tene te ya rat chona rangin po gamba kapsula tene karlam charwata tene po mi patenzo yapo saltap gu ta thig nan som Tene ta di kapsala noa tembe kabre. Tan cheba tembe kap malam chara yung du te la. Tene ta di ke kap tena la. Tene ta che dipa sobe kongsa ina te zin toh nong dabo che ke yo re la. Le takpanda ina tene ta te che khandro ma thong che ke so an dabo ta tende yung ke yo so re la.
Chepe kapsa.
Chepe kapsala. Malam che kapsala. Tene di du tena la. Tene pogu re. Tene karlam kharwe kapsalam poa sal tap. Malam kharwe kap tena la. Tene ngus ta ngarang nambre khiba de yang po song sombe mi bat nang ku re so.
The first thing is the time when it is appropriate to perform the ejection of consciousness. And whether you were doing it for yourself or you were doing it for someone else, it is essential that it be done at the right time and not be done at the wrong time. The wrong time principally refers to doing it too early in the process of dying. One reason for this is that up to a certain point in the dissolution process, it is still possible that the person might be resuscitated. Basically, until the course or external dissolution of the elements is completed, the person could be revived. And therefore, if the ejection of consciousness is done before that process is completed, you could be hastening the person's death. So it is unfit to perform the ejection of consciousness until that external dissolution is completely done with. About this in the Tantras it says, perform the ejection of consciousness at the right time. Because if you do it at the wrong time, you are killing the deities within the body. Here, deities within the body principally refers to protective deities that are attracted to and abide within one's body. If you perform the ejection of consciousness, either for yourself or for another, before you are actually dead, then you are abruptly you're actually causing the death and abruptly removing these deities. Another reason for this to be an issue is that although if you're doing it for someone else, although it's that person's intention that you do it for them, if you do it too early, they may experience it as a hastening of their death, and that could make them quite mad at you, which would be a problem, because then they would be, in spite of the ejection of consciousness, entering into the bardo in a state of anger, which is not good. So for those two reasons, and whether you are performing the ejection of consciousness for yourself or for another, it's important not to do it too early on. So when can you do it? You should do it after the elements have dissolved, and so as soon as possible after the breathing stops. Now, the period where you want to be doing it is during the stages of the internal or subtle dissolution, the whiteness, redness, and blackness, which here are given their proper names of appearance, increase, and attainment. As you'll remember, this threefold dissolution process is the gradual cessation of 80 types of thinking. It is during this that you want to perform the ejection of consciousness. Ideally, when you're doing it for yourself, when the first of these, the appearance, which is the experience of radiant whiteness, occurs, you want to generate the visualization for the ejection of consciousness and thereby prepare yourself to do it. And then when the whiteness turns into the redness, in other words, when appearance changes into increase, you want to actually perform the ejection of consciousness. At this point in the text, it mentions that during the second of these three appearances, the red appearance of increase, those who have engaged in great wrongdoing may actually experience some fear, And those who have engaged in great virtue may witness dakinis and dakas and so forth, leading them to pure realms. That's the point where you want to perform the actual ejection itself.
Tene ta te jeso ta timpo tutene te jeso tampo damare la po damwa te la ta tangpo jangbare po jangba te la chitang namba ngayo re jangba te la namba ngaye benane tangpo chugun po atong longgun po asinkin namba ni yo re la te la jangya hira yo mare kare re se na chugun po atene tene ta tanda 조름 개념는 제버던 봐봐 사제침부터 조바침부게 mikpatenzo 야보지 검니 드니 다 딘치우 깝터나라 디팅엔진 정원도 봐다 가신 공도 이게 바다르도 단다 예 주니 마봉원테 반다고 제게 땡도 로저레 마도텔라 믹살금 포 mik반다고 된데 가야지 나가 이어 말해라 제지 다 롱군 포아테야 간데지레세나 대답을 띵엔진 정원도 반잠도 한다고 말했대 옛날에 제레미야 보제 이람잘라이 제레미야 보제 여네 되네 다 대요 답을 줄리디 이람잘라이 답을 거의 노 샤르네 되네 다 딩온도 야 되네 야 루장보다 답을 힘강라서 발레데야가 되네 람장보 제버던 파파인 비처나 다 대답을 미살게 다 롱그 포아 장바 인세네 chukumpo dangba insine jangya mixabi yo marete inaya jerem to zorem te namba ni la tene pe nyangto chepar chinji jela chipa hindu te koran chewe tu la pana kale hiro maguba ranghingi tene ta yang takpala devu yang takpala rogi ore la tene rogi ore teacher na ta ti chukumpo to longkumpo ni ne ta tendire 다 나란서 간디 장국이 요아레세나 데네 뚜금포아디 장국이 요아레라 뚜금포아다 숨바텔라 뚜금포아다 이바텔라 신라라면 포아싱키데 데 넘버니 요아레라 다텔라 검술게 체퍼테 사치레모 데네 다텔라 모라 체퍼히바 요마레 소마레라 데네 데야 다테 뚜구 짤종금 포아세도 다때 nga랑 냠닝게 값서 짤종니 강국이 와래라 다때 단단히 nga랑서 장국이 와래 티 장주도 갈체게 와래 데니 다때야 장출라 지당게 다 동어 소소소소 동어 만다와 람포아 만다와 감출 데니 요아레티 이나요 감술 좀지 제발을 마도 다 된다 장야가 되네 된다데 찍반다 보지는 로기 와래 되네 다 돼야 nengo 안 보때 따완다 보때 간디지레세나 지당게 다 단다 루센이데 단달린제도 네데 말에 다 가생게 값을 주바yen도라 소롱데 오면농도 네데데 되네 루센이데 이엘미도 이엘미가 넘바테가 초로와티 샤우네 루센이데 이엘미도 네데도 루라 샘기 잡데 반다보테다 샘라 루기 잡데 반다보테 요아레라 데 루동 센이 이엘미라보디 인주 샘티 히바사리그 넘바레 루디 펜보 두둑 넘바레 레데 이나야 타콜 루센 근데바티 예네 다 다ንसिंग 근데바시나 인다 조깅 근데바시나 인다 루센 근데바시나 인다 데 코니 제기질은 데네 다디 류레 만다와라 센네데 바제다 데네 다 디처나 데타부지시는 루센 근데바시는 네데 바레라 다 딘체위 값을라 다 소는 거는도 소는데 요원라 때네 다 디게 류단 센니 다 치와스기데 소소는 달리는 거요 류데 뱀보들 좀 로에 남발은저 히바사리데 때네 소르테 때네 레지지 순랑네 로고요 와라 다 디값을로 초로와 간데 용기 요아레세나 때네 나라서 못게 나나 요아라 컴바 드바던다 와지리네 여도 숨기던데 요아라 드는 강바데 마 헤이 소만 기데 드는 티 난그 초로와데 티나랑 나랑 디데 바나기 다 실로로 탱고 그래 선바테게 초로와 다 강바데 헤이 소는 나랑 실로로 탱고 그래 선바타고데 용그래라 페테겐도 Tene ta chilo la tangu ngarang kompa nong lan zu de pa nang ta chilo la tangu gre samba ta ba chi yung yo re tene chilo la tangu be samba te undu te la ta chilo la tangu yo re la chilo la tang undu te la tene ta te leg ji sun rang ne ta chilo la tangu yo re tene te la chitang go go si yo re la tene ta te mai nawa na mai nawa na ka tewa la so pata te sia thori gel le zangbo sa pa ina thori gel lutin na che una tene mai la so pa ya lute go ni ro ta tene ma le ngamba so ni ngen song ne sun ro na tene te o go ta san ne la so pa go mi ni man ro de la tin ro ne ta ku ten rir ki chui ni ge go tene ta na tene ta ti lutin ngamba ta lutin zangbo nda bo je leng ge yo de la te ta ku le to chung yo 다 나란서 포하게 타키데 간데지레세나 데니 디게 나니 고 탐지게 나니 고 야큐데 지오 총부가 세 타카팔라텔라 지츠트나라 미구 춘춘 제 요아라라 미구 춘춘 데니 야제 넘버 히바데 단 톱나 데니 제 레장보 사바탄 띵은지 제버진다 다 냠린 제버진 게 때니 다 나야 탱국이 와라라 드니 야지 탱톱나 드니 랍나 다 또바 제버진 질 제와다 데이터부 마존나요 다 제와 잠볼레인트 반다고 텐데 용기 와라라 데데 텐들기 추니게 다데 용기 와래 나랑 냠도 야보 예바 테니 다 텐데지나 테니 안로토 바제 용기 와라라 테니 단다 포아 생기테 젠탑 거네 다 테니 안 로주가 테니 나란소 젠탑 시네 다 테니 안 로주가 다디 체기 와래 테니 데 단다 다 디갑 드나라 테니 나랑 미과티 드나야 테니 젠탑 거네 다 지워 총부 보가니야 템베가 타지세도 테니 코란 고데 야보 송도 테니 다 테니 대나티 지워 냠바 마이 바 지워 상보 너보지 랭게 와래 지워 상보 렘바타 냠도 체버지 지워한다고 다 텐데 용기 와래라 티 존센데 칸데지레세나 다 테라 나란수 송노타오 가살라 남바 상지베 타와라 레준데 칼체게 요 랭엠바소나 다 테트나라 랭엠바티 데브 냠반 중기 요 레 정보소나 데브 상본 중기 요 마도 테네 렌데라 지워 총부 보가네 단도디 지워 상보 렌지 예바티 렌데 양타밤 마인반다보진 로게 마르베 선반다보 태선 다 데치데치 사와 용그레데 옛날에 데 마레 다 데라 나랑 그 당보 당바데야 장바지세 디 레라 테니 야치주니 안로토 바제다 테니 데라 제와 상보지 랑네 테니 제 랭엠 반다보 데치데치 사바 다보 여나야 디 루틴 데라 림지 장네 테니 림지 레송보 사바가 고갑 다보지 톱나 레상보 사바 데라 테니 랭엠 누바데 림지 총동도 베르나 나란스 손치 셈비 제발은 주바가 나온다 송나 테니 단다 테니 테네 튼티메기 데게나 디파힌도 메지 세나요 팔라테네 지파침보다 강라테네 히지드론죠 세타테 페르나 디파침보 제 세가 옆 공사 제 이나 테라 게와 자침보 종주 생지 검호 제버진지 질 지나 테니 티게 디파티게 첨보라 내가 말 데저데저 내그래 가르레세나 메지 미니바진지 다 사천 년가진지는 로고요나 테니 테 나랑 장반로나 다 티메겐다 그종 동 자세 다 텐데 지기 년가 요래라 테니 나랑 다 냠들라 메파오 테니 콘센이야바 테니 센차이야바 구숭다고 망보제다 냠든 로나 다 테니 히라 도마고바 텐주기 년가 히라 마네바 로토고 요래라 베테 연도 나랑 그 딕바 침부지 세가 요나요 손주 센지 겨와자 침부지 여나 테니 디기 레전드부터 대점 메마고바 테니 로토고 요래서 다 가히 테네 저바탐지가 나는 빼가네 tene nyalwar ji be le se jong go na wa zam jin jong se ta tin de song yo la nyalwa la ji gu be le ji so yo na ya ta song ju sen de be gyo top chen bo yin be ong ke tene be ngo na ga sin go na tene de ge nyalwa ji be le de di pa de chang ro ji ban da ta tin de ge wi top ji tin de song ye ba de ta tene ta ya chen ju ga na ne song na de ne tun ti me yin de chen na ke ji ji gi par se song yo la tene pe na me chenpo je mbar yung tu tene ti na ne tsa ra chung tenzo pa rang yin ki sek ndo yo tene chasang me pa sin ndo yo pe te yen do gewa de top chenpo yin pa song tu te la tene dikpa tenzo kap ka la tene tsa de me pa sin ndo yo pe na te ta pa je se ne ta nga ra poa ya po je tep nga rang kan poa ya po je dang tene tela tene poa ya po je chang na tene le chen de po tenzo tene ti lu ting sang po ti ta ndo rimbi ki dang ne tene nyam su nyong ma gu pa si na rimbi ki ta tu pa ta zang ma nang tu pa na po je yung yo re la ti chen na ta tene chen poa ja yo re
And next we come to the instructions for the ejection of consciousness. And the instructions first present how to practice it, how to train yourself in this. Now, generally speaking, there are 5 types of Shamatha somendo. Shamatha somendo. Juku poa. Longu poa. Drugu poa, lame jinlakji poa. Ngapalano. 5 of which so far we've heard about 4, or you will have heard about 4. The first of these is called Dharmakaya ejection, and the second is called Sambhogakaya ejection. And neither of these actually constitute a separate practice. Neither of these are what is normally referred to or commonly referred to as the ejection of consciousness. Because what's called the Dharmakaya ejection of consciousness is to rest in the samadhi of either Mahamudra or the great perfection during the dissolution and dying process. So it is performed by someone who has consummate training in either or both of those traditions, and thereby, through resting in that samadhi, causes the mother and child clear lights to meet. So what is called the Dharmakaya ejection of consciousness really refers to resting in the true samadhi of the ultimate completion stage. In a similar way, what's called Sambhogakaya ejection of consciousness refers to doing the practice of the generation stage during the process of dying. And this is practiced by someone who has principally emphasized a clear appearance and stable practice of the generation stage in their practice during their life. By remaining in the samadhi of the generation stage during death, then when they enter the bardo, they arise in the pure illusory body of their deity or yidam, and as a result achieve excellent birth in the corresponding a pure realm. So the first 2 types of the ejection of consciousness really refer to the samadhis of the completion stage and generation stage respectively. And individuals who've perfected these do not require any other means of ejection. So what is the ejection of consciousness that is actually practiced? It is primarily the third, which is called the Nirmanakaya ejection of consciousness achieved through training. The fourth, which is called the ejection of consciousness through the Guru's blessing, is very similar to the third, and in a sense doesn't need to be considered separately from it. Generally speaking, what is practiced, what is cultivated as a practice, therefore is the third, the Nirmanakaya ejection. Now, with regard to how this is practiced, there are a large number of varieties. Each tradition will have its own characteristic set of visualizations for the ejection of consciousness. And so the details of the visualizations can vary. But the essential technique and the point is the same. To understand this technique and this point, you need to understand the whole outlook on which the ejection of consciousness is based. Throughout our lives, our bodies and our minds are mixed up with one another. They are inseparable as long as the life wind or vitality wind remains within the central channel. So that you could actually say that your body and your mind pervade one another. Although they are very different, the mind is cognition, not matter, and the body is matter, not cognition. They are held together by as a condition by the vitality wind and as a cause by the fixation on the self. As long as they're held together in this way throughout one's life, the one does not pass beyond the other. Wherever there is the body, there is the mind, and wherever there is the mind, there is the body. What we call death is the separation of these two previously inseparable things. And they separate completely. Your body becomes an inanimate corpse, and your mind becomes a pure cognition, a mere lucid cognition, without any kind of material basis. What happens when you die is, as it's said in various commentaries, like a house caving in or a building collapsing. If you're in a building that is collapsing, it is worth your while to escape. So the preparation for death here is learning how to escape the building at the moment before it caves in on you. Now, since by definition death will drive you out of the building or residence of your body anyway, you might ask, why is it important to consciously escape, since you will be driven out? If you are driven out, in other words, if you do not consciously eject your consciousness, but if you are driven out by death, then the force that drives you out is your karma. And therefore, you will leave the particular gate of your body that corresponds to your preponderant karma, and will have no choice but to take the corresponding rebirth. In other words, if you're driven out, you have no control over what happens after that. There are 9 gates that your consciousness might leave out of at the time of death. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the navel, the genitals, and the anus. Does that make... No, do we get 9? Eyes, ears... Go J. Oh, that's a J. Yeah, those are the 8 bad ones. Then there's the good one. Okay. So there should be 1, 2. There should be 8. Oh, they check the young jablet. Yeah, the other one is the back of the skull. Anyway, so those are of the 9. Those are the 8 conventional ones. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the navel, the genitals, the anus, and the back of the skull. Now, the way it works is that it can be more specific than this, but basically, if your consciousness leaves out of one of the upper ones, then you are going to be reborn in a higher realm, in a positive birth. And if your consciousness leaves out of one of the lower ones, like the genitals or the anus, then you're going to be reborn in a lower realm. Now, the reason for this is that the departure of the consciousness from that part of the body is the condition, not the cause, but the condition for that birth. The cause of the birth and the cause of that departure is the karma you've accumulated that is the cause of that specific type of birth. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that the birth you take is karmically driven, it does require the condition of a certain avenue of departure from the body to take effect. Therefore, if you can control where your consciousness leaves the body from, you can control to some extent your rebirth. Now, the best gate to leave the body, for your consciousness to leave the body, is the ninth one, which is the aperture at the very center of the top of the head. And if your consciousness departs the body through that gate, in the best cases, a realization will occur, and at the very least, you will have a good rebirth. And this is because of the interdependent relationship between the condition of the point of departure and the subsequent birth. Now, if someone has realization, strong realization, at death their consciousness will automatically depart out of that aperture or gate because it is a result of their realization. What you do in the practice of the ejection of consciousness is, rather than leaving it up to realization, you learn to force your consciousness out of that gate, forcefully. And if you succeed, you will at the very least have a good rebirth. Now you might ask why. After all, is it not a Buddhist belief that rebirth is caused by our karma, and that if we've done bad things, we'll have a bad rebirth, and if we've done good things, we'll have a good rebirth? Does not the effectiveness of the ejection of consciousness contradict this? In fact, it does not, for several reasons. First of all, you can only do it if you're trained to do it. And the training itself is, among other things, the accumulation of a powerful force of positive karma. For another thing, you are actually, by achieving a good rebirth that you might not otherwise have achieved, you are deferring the undergoing of negative karma, not necessarily getting rid of it. But by taking a good rebirth, you give yourself the opportunity to gradually purify your remaining negative karma under appropriate circumstances. In fact, this idea is not unique to the ejection of consciousness. It is often said to be true of the practice of bodhicitta in general. For example, we find in the Bodhicharyavatara the statement, "The generation of bodhicitta enables one to escape the vicious attack of one's own actions, just as being accompanied by a strong and fully armed bodyguard protects you from attack by your enemies." The reason for this is that bodhicitta is a strong force of virtue. Therefore, it causes the results of your actions to be less strong than they would otherwise have been. And therefore, it is like an analogy being accompanied by someone who is strong enough and skillful enough to defend you from those who would otherwise be able to successfully attack you. For example, it's said that if someone generates bodhicitta, as a result of that, the karma that would otherwise have caused them to be reborn in hell may simply result in a strong headache. Elsewhere in the Bodhicharyavatara, if you suffer from migraines, that would make sense to you. Elsewhere in the Bodhicharyavatara, it says, like the fire at the end of time, the matchless power of bodhicitta can in an instant destroy even the greatest wrongdoing. And this is because of the intense power of the virtue of bodhicitta. Well, the same thing is true in the specific case of the ejection of consciousness. It allows you to propel yourself into a positive rebirth where you will have the opportunity to gradually purify that karma that might otherwise have caused you to be reborn in a lower state.
Tene tampo dang begapsala ta jitang ge damdo dang sim jing han dang song yo la ta ngara zo Namba Sanji Pichu, and Song Doji Tipetuma Impe, Long La, Dabson Roa, and Song Chuchu to Saint Jepate, Calcia in Pichena, Tinite, Tav, Jambu Sinjingan to Tony, Java Lucini, Zeta Luna Nungichu, Den La Sopata, Demba, Go Ni, Tati, and Poati, Jangi Orella. Tenim Poati, Tachitang, Pogi Choga Mambu already in Aranzo, Kaju on the Siena, Tatanda, Yiram Jala Korum Jerem Temba, Captain Song Yorella, Yiram Gala Karigongi or the Senata, Chudugi, Yanogam Poanda, which Nangi, Yanogam Poati Nangi or Tika Salan, Dojipam Gum, Tinangi or Teni tatanda report making poetry nangi orella tikasala rangul with papa chiris chikor gum tatin days in teni te nando te kuluga nando teni saoma gum teni tinde nangi ore tati jerem te gum ne teni tanda narupa gasana goji koru karkumchi goji chaja chimbulam goji chene goji tsi tatin de song orella teni tesi du telan korwe go tenzo la teni rang tukani yiger shari tuni shati go te zo ka ni ta nam hin ro samme panda bu te je pe ta pwa jang bu kap sala teni ge mi pa nang chu ta teni tanda jiwo chong bu ga te ta tanda korang ngni chung chung je yore de yin na te jang bu kap sala pe teni 카침부여 반다고지 막 미는 것데 받지 야때 드니 카침부치 때 받지 검 다딘로 대위게 쯤다고지
그래서 음악에 야네카 가진다
근데 검네 드니 다 대답 검네 드니 대라 다단다 조 저 총부 부가라 드니 와범이 여기에 봐 검바다 다 되게 뚜고 단다 뚜군 포가 가서라 와범이 여기에 봐 검바다 신라 라면 포가 가서라 드니 라랑 라마 검발라서 바다 간데 나마야 데 라마티 산지 응어진도 길라서 바까 뭐 첨보지지네 다 된데지네 드리비게 포아 미파 파르네 딘 잘장겨
The practice of the ejection of consciousness always begins with, in each session, going for refuge and generating bodhicitta, as is true of any practice in the Buddhist tradition, in particular that of the Vajrayana. The first part of the technique is the proper physical posture, which is the usual one, the 7 dharmas of Vairocana. And then you perform the specific visualization associated with whichever practice of ejection you're going to do. There are a large number of these. The most common ones done by Kagyu practitioners are 2. And the deity you visualize yourself as depends upon which one you are doing. If you are doing the ejection of consciousness that is part of the 6 dharmas of Naropa, you would visualize yourself as Vajravarahi, Vajrayogini. And if you are doing the ejection of consciousness that is part of the Amitabha cycle, you would visualize yourself as Avalokiteshvara. In either case, you visualize yourself clearly as the deity and visualize the Avaduti, the central channel, within your body. Now the next thing you do is what was referred to by the Mahapandit Naropa when he said, since the 8 gates lead to samsara, and the one is the skylight of Mahamudra, close the 8 and open the 1. Well, how do you do this? You think that Shri syllables emanated from the seed syllable in your heart, flowing throughout your body, come to rest in the 8 gates, other than the good one, and block them, seal them off, close them. And then you direct your attention to this upper gate. And although, in fact, physically speaking, it is quite slender, it is quite small as an aperture, you visualize it as fairly wide open. Therefore, you visualize that the Avaduti is somewhat flared at the upper end, is wider at the upper end than it is at the bottom. You also visualize that it is closed or sealed off at the bottom. And then you visualize above your head the deity into whose heart you are going to eject your consciousness. It is most commonly the Buddha Amitabha in most forms of Nirmanakaya ejection. If you're performing the fourth type of ejection, ejection through the blessing of the Guru, then instead of Amitabha, you would visualize your root Guru above your head with the confidence that he is an actual Buddha. Having established that visualization, you then train yourself in repeatedly ejecting your consciousness into the heart of the deity.
Tene ta rang number hibata, tene rang loni, tan dupingo te tilete gone tene te ya par, tene jitsu la sanje abame te jarwa sambi yutonge yubi hamterti, jo gane tene tena ti habla rexam sine tene ma pa, ya par ta tene sine zarjang yore, te zarjang te ta. Tini tengen tala, tini ya tsesing tabla, tini tanda rang jiwo di doji jatam chika wola yege homi ya pache, chika kaani, tini tili datsipa, wapa me te ya rang hingala ma yoni, tini ti tsepa me nambala njursun sabata tini gomni tati, ti ke tender ki chuni ke ta chitanga ngaranso, jai tendel la tene tangaram phogi yin sambadabuti ngaram lundal dege me sambadabuti kapkala tsela nepa ndabu yo te meyo tabla tini tanda sege sesini me mate nambi wa.
There is some difference between the way the practice is done in training and the way it is done in application. In training, you visualize that the Buddha Amitabha, seated above your head, is seated in the posture of Maitreya. That is, he's seated as though he were sitting in a chair with his legs and feet hanging over the lotus. And his feet cover the top of the open end of the Abhaduti. When you perform the ejection practice, therefore, you repeatedly think, combining it with the practice of the winds, that your mind and wind, inseparable in the form of a small sphere of light, are shot up through the central channel forcefully until they touch or hit the soles of Amitabha's feet. They don't actually go, when you're training, when you're practicing, they don't actually go any farther than that. And then each time they shoot up, then you bring the sphere back down and you do it again repeatedly. Between sessions of this practice, you do specific things to ensure your longevity. At the conclusion of the session, you think that Amitabha moves down through the central channel, taking the form of the Buddha Amitayas, the form associated with longevity. You thereafter think that the aperture at the top of the central channel is covered and blocked by a double vajra, beneath which is the syllable hum, from which flows amrita, that is the essence of longevity. And then, visualizing Amitayas in your heart, you recite the mantras of longevity and so on. The reason for doing this is that because of the nature of interdependence, if you spend sessions of time planning on escaping your body, it can shorten your life. So you, just in case.
Tini, tanda po ngaga nong ye hibarela. Tini ngaba kachik po ate sani hyo po lela jawa. Tinso sani hyo na tering te samchi na. Tini tawanda po nangyo na naro.
So we've gone through the first 4 of the 5 types of ejection. The 5th is called the celestial or Kichari ejection, and I'll discuss that and also the actual application of ejection at the time of death tomorrow. For now, we'll stop, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask, go ahead.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding yesterday. I've heard that when you fall asleep, it is similar to the dissolution process at the time of death. And I have two parts to the question. Does this similarity apply only to the external dissolution of the elements? Because it sounds like you would actually die if the internal dissolution truly occurred. And secondly, are there any specific practices that Rinpoche thinks would be useful for us to try to become aware of this dissolution process when we fall asleep?
That the susuke ni kukpe kapsu the shiveke timrim dong chatumba tsamshi ke timrim yogo songs. De kwala tewa ni dos. Tewa dampo de ni kukpa ke timrim de chi jongwa temba tsamrebe yana de nangchi topsum la sopa chatsangwa repes. De tewa dampo dong. Tewa nipa de timrim de ni kukpa ke timrim de lamdo chewa ke mikpaam nyamnan kangokdo.
다 되게 조대 진정한데 봐다. 근데 나는 깔람 말람 마음 된저야 섭사 춘춘 된데 샤고서 말이. 샤고요. 샤고 요래때 이나야 나란서 다때 두준도 너민가 온도 손도 때라 기도 무슨 말 깔리카고 기도 요래라데. 티샤르송하고 기도 갑갑 저기요 말. La ripa yapu je dremne teni tanda da dela ni yapu je tombo ngaranso tenhi pai teni ni kugu yapu je da tenhi pai hachang ten che na ni bu tende yung yo la da dela te tang ji ga na so na teni sia sam yapu sa teni ni ma kha hi ni mu teni tel tro yapo che tachirani do yapo nguzone te tende ngone te kali tana choro di choro da bote te sinyong to pando yung yo teniso te tel kamne birin bigi ngozere.
It's primarily the outer dissolution, but it's said that a sort of lesser or less intense version of the whiteness, redness, and blackness does happen as well. The problem is because we tend to become unconscious as we're falling asleep, we generally don't consciously experience these things. We're unaware of them, although they do appear. So the practice of dealing with this consists of gaining the ability to go to sleep with focused awareness. In other words, to become physically asleep without becoming unconscious. This essentially is done by cultivating a strong faculty of mindfulness and alertness before going to sleep that will not be destroyed by the process of going to sleep. The problem with that, however, is obvious. If the mindfulness and alertness is strong enough not to become unconscious, then it is probably going to be strong enough to keep you from falling asleep. The solution to this that is recommended in the traditional texts is that before attempting this practice, you take several measures. One is to make sure that you eat nutritious food. The second is don't sleep for a few nights before you do it, so that you'll be able to go to sleep even though you're mindful and aware. And then also you need a friend there to remind you that you're falling asleep, remind you to be mindful and so on. And essentially it consists of doing this, practicing this over a long period until you gain the ability to do it.
Rinpoche, briefly, just wondering, when one visualizes the 3 syllable, if you're visualizing it as if you're reading it, or if it's facing someone, that someone facing you is reading it. And the same
Which
with the
3
hum.
syllable? The ones
The
that
threes
the
that
block
are at
the block the gates.
Yes.
That the goje kakpa ke shrik detso ke yigo chiten rebe nangten rebe.
Yingmo cherte.
They would be read from the outside.
From the outside. And is this also the same with at the end with the hum syllable, that
Hum.
that seals?
Hom de gonjulu.
Yeah, except it's upside down.
Rinpoche, when I was much younger, I had a motorcycle accident in which I lost about half of my blood and was in the emergency room, out of my body. My consciousness was clearly separated from my body. And I was up on the ceiling watching the medics and doctors running around, attending my body, but very aware that my body was not my consciousness. So what in that situation is happening? What stage of this process is that? And how, was that a form of poa in a sense, where the body, my consciousness left my body, or was it something else?
That the lusam drana shiware song song dwa. Ngoma ko lo chunjun kapsa tene baba ke de dabne. Tene korang tra kanya patte cheka sam sho song se. Menkang la trene tene ko menkang ge myamba konso ke lopo ke da kang like a mompo lejo yorwa. Tetso ke korang de kangba ke toga ne tong song se. Korang ge namshe de tende lu ge chilo yores. Ko yane ma tane de korang ge lupo tong yore. Amche tso ke like a lejo de tetso tong yore. Selpo tong yores. De kaso Lucem de tets tralsons. De that the timrim ge nana kavato down, de ang pena de powada over pe kandares.
Te chu che. Tatinde di somna. Sacholatan, chobelatan, melamatan, lonongalatan. Tatinde gabna injira.
Ora.
Pasi injira.
He says he thinks that probably what happened was that your consciousness separated from the body because you must have stopped breathing at one point. Which would be the conclusion of this. So you at least went through the dissolution of the elements, the whole outer.
Sonung nupa te siho. Te yar pa. Te zam ma yo. Te sonung nupa te ya. So tubanda wachi untalimendo.
What says he hasn't experienced this himself, so he's not 100% sure. But it sounds like what happened was that because of the accident, your vitality wind or your life wind was temporarily weakened so much that your consciousness could escape. But then it was reactivated, and which caused your consciousness to return to its place.
And how does the consciousness at that point re-enter and re-establish this connection with the body?
Te dawage pena ngune shiwa mare, de namshe tet yar songwe kapso, namshe kane tsu zogere dang. Then what was the second part? How does it re-enter and how does it
re-establish the connection with the body?
De kapso te lusem ge drawa che tsawa repe che matsawa yinang the lusem ge drawa te jordawa.
Ngrang samna lusem ge deva cheda deva chi su lusem ge deva ti yang jet so to banda chi chu men ro.
Oh la sa.
Samba che ta te korang kani zuain korang nyom nyom jiro.
In answer to your first question, you probably have a better idea of how your consciousness got back into your body than anybody else does. And basically the connection between the mind and body was not severed. It was kind of stretched. And but it wasn't broken so that it was able to return.
Thank you.
Rinpoche, my question is for the pregnant women and the people who serve them, who I work with. if a being should die in utero or immediately after birth, is the dissolution process the same, and are the practices for that being the same? And similarly, if a child should be miscarried or aborted, is the dissolution and practice the same?
That the morange the mayo yensare memba yana mayo yana that the chemen so ge pugu chebe kaso samsam pugu mache gon la na la shigi ora samsam de chet sana lamsam shigi ores de den de so ge temrim chikpare be dang consola pempa ge nyamlen chikpare bes bena ngan nan de shiwam Chetsa and Lamsang Shawa, Detso la Pempa Ginyamlan Detso Chikbarebe. When you say practices, are you referring specifically to the ejection of consciousness?
Yes, and also the practices to support that being in finding a better rebirth.
Pawa dang chedon so teneng de Bardo Simchen la Pempe Tap Mompoyor, Detso Zamala Segiore.
Bardo Simchen Pempe Tap Sine Tibaindre.
Chikbare. Tene. Timrim chikbarebe.
Timrim pachichi baindri.
Oh, listen. Tene pawa chikbarebe.
Pawa dangna, pawa tapna, tibaindri.
It would all be the same. The stages of dissolution would be the same. The performance of the ejection of consciousness would be the same, and certainly the other practices for benefiting the being in the bardo would all be the same.
Thank you very much.
Rinpoche, my question probably is much for Lama Yeshe. I didn't get each of the steps clearly written down when you went through them. Will we go through them again later, or are they part of the empowerment?
Of the ejection of consciousness
Yeah.
you're talking about? That the Pawa ge mikpa ge rumba tetso sapo drangamendos yangcha sungi yimbe.
Yangcha jahigni, kariri sena, teni ngunin pawa dangna, lama te teni ti tone chogan dan tan teni gomtan mi patin zu hiye ko ne teni shona te yo chegre teni ngarang tanda kare hiye yo ara sen chitang pwa jang du tang ngarang su hiye ka lam pwa tin de jang na pemba yo re pwa tin de jang na ti ge kare se gru tawa nda te hiye yo ra teni sin pengre peni junsin tin de re teni taati ngaran tsuku nyamlin chego re teni renda wuji shogi warawa teni nguni ta ngaran puwa nyamlin chego yin somna teni lama chayi teni tizani choga karinda nyamlin karisi mipa kandisi denzu kandisi tenzu labna ti yakyo mari.
Well, I'm not going to go through it again, Rinpoche said, because I'm not really intending this to be technical instruction or practical instruction in the ejection of consciousness. It's essentially an explanation of the theory behind it, so that you understand the role it serves, the value of it, when it is applied, how it is applied, and what its purpose is, as well as its benefit. If someone wants to practice the ejection of consciousness, they would need to go to a teacher and get specific instruction in any one of the many varieties of it. And the instruction would include how to use the liturgy, the physical aspect of the practice, every aspect of the visualization, and so on, all of which has to be explained in detail before you can do it. Here we're really concerned with the theory behind it and its role in general.
Thank you.
Rinpoche, I have a question about this second stage of the dissolution in terms of two things. One is, how long is this period? And secondly, what if you kind of make a wrong turn somewhere in it? Is it possible to actually correct oneself and become aware and practice properly?
Second stage, do you mean water dissolving into fire, or do you mean the appearance increase in attainment? Second stage of two or second stage of many? That's what I'm trying to figure, which second stage.
I guess the actual part where you die.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That the timrim nangi timrim nangji to sungi kola tewa nido. Tewa dampo de soso ke te tsam trudram su songwa yina. Soso ke pena drempa shoba yina. De jela yang drempa lep tugrepes. Sigrepes. De chikdang. Nisana chidangza de nangji to sum la dutsu katsu kogre.
nongchi topsam ku tusi te chenpa ya dongwa sikiri baya. Tene nongchi topsam ku tusi te something ki hyo sikiri warel. Something ki hyo se na tene kahi something ki hyo nga zong do zong ta tene zong warel. Something ki hyo se na tene ngarang ke sem namin ke ondo mahirwa kase gam tukudu. Tene tela kahi ga ta pena chuse jay zong ganto kahi chuse cheka zong ganto ta ti soso lo le tene tingen zen jinyo nyon da wi ra menkin nan te ripsa ya yal du yo tingen zen jinyo nyon te si yo ne sante zine chan ra ya po yo na ta ti something ji kyo nga te ngarang chuse jay la ganto wa chuse nga zong ta te ne tu yo ra.
It's possible, even if you become distracted during it, that you could regain awareness. As for the duration of it, it's generally measured in meditation days. And it's said that the inner dissolution generally lasts for 5 or 6 meditation days. Now, a meditation day is the period in which that person can remain with a mind that is undistracted from meditation. So if someone can rest with an undistracted mind for 1 hour, then it would last for 5 or 6 hours. If they can rest with an undistracted mind for half an hour, it would last for 2.5 or 3. And if someone has no meditation experience or training, it all happens very quickly.
Thank you.
This will be the last question.
Rinpoche, my experience with POA has been that it requires a lot of exertion and it's a forceful activity. My question is, how can somebody whose elements have already dissolved engage in this kind of activity?
That morange poa jongyos, poa jongwante luchi tsurwa chembo rao gogidos. The data de dewo yepe kapsa yang kala kapo yana tene soso shive kapsa timrim tsane kanushe jato gres.
Tate tangbo dangbo kapla luchi tsurwa chembo gogire de te kamne te le te mi patin zola te tap derundwa te kamchanda topu kicheto.
Well, that's why you have to practice it before. When you're first practicing it, it does require a great deal of effort. But as you become skilled in it, it requires less effort. And when you're skilled enough to be able to apply it, it's not that difficult.
So would you say that it could be applied almost through intention?
Then the dunbage po sigarepes. The sushishive kapsa the poa dene dunbage.
That important
Primarily it is, in fact, through the recollection of it.
Jangbe kapla choganda tene mikpasi tene jangbe yore. Tan ngonne lela jago kapsala tamatsi chitan sani unjirede. Yena yon kurantate tenhi koni tenhi.
This will be discussed tomorrow, but briefly put, when you're practicing it, when you're training in it, you use a liturgy and there's a very conscious and formal training. When you apply it, then the whole thing is somewhat more spontaneous and less formalized.
So could you even be lying down?
Pena de... Yep.
Thank you.
I'm Sa